Hello and welcome to Griffin's 2024 Virtual Expo. My name is George Grant, Technical Services Manager for GGS Pro at Griffin. I'm excited to talk to you about strategies and processes GGS Pro utilizes to solve both simple and complex problems growers face year to year. Ultimately, our goal within Griffin's GGS Pro team is to provide the tools and knowledge for you to identify plant problems accurately and make effective decisions efficiently during each production season. Today's presentation will cover some emerging trends and topics related to insect and mite control, as well as plant growth regulators. GS Pro is the technical support pillar of Griffin Greenhouse Supplies, and it is a unique service. Griffin is the only single source supplier for horticultural needs that provides a free technical support team to help solve your simple and complex issues. Please feel free to reach out to GGS Pro if you have not already or you're not currently using us. It is amazing what one conversation can lead to. We can be reached via phone or email using the contact information listed on this slide. As you can see, we have a 6-person team, including myself. I'm grateful to be leading such a gifted team of leaders with all different backgrounds, personally and professionally. As you can see, we're spread out all over the country, and our territory spans from coast to coast as well. GGS Pro produces quite a few publicly available bulletins, guides, and resources. This frankly comes from the input you provide us and the inquiries you provide us. So we thank you for this two-way communication. As you bring us inquiries and issues, it puts certain things on our radar as far as things we do need to be producing in writing and something that we can be sharing with you. We've also written our renowned technical reference guide, which is available in both English and Spanish. We're currently actually working on the 6th edition for the technical reference guide now. We've also created 4 scouting flipbooks to help you diagnose various abiotic and biotic issues on the spot, as well as act as a training guide for new growers. Reach out to your local Griffin sales rep to see how you can get one of these valuable resources mailed to your operation directly. Now let's jump into this presentation. Although we will not be talking about sanitation, we must highlight that starting clean is essential for staying clean. Inter and intra-season sanitation is the first step in preventing insect and mite issues. Please see our other recorded presentation on hot topics for disease management and sanitation for further details on this foundational set of practices. Some scenario that's very clean, like we just saw before, does not stay clean throughout the season. This sort of environment is perfect breeding ground for various pests and diseases, some of which we'll be touching on in today's presentation. Let's begin with one of the most difficult pests to control that we deal with today, which is mealybugs. They're growing in pressure across the country, especially as growers increase the diversity of their product offerings and are bringing on indoor tropical or foliage crops. This plant group is a magnet for mealybugs. Regardless if you are harboring them season after season or bringing them in up from the southeast, mealies remain a pain because of how they hide well in the nooks and crannies of the plant and are considerably resistant to many of our pesticides. Besides being great at hiding, mealybugs have a protective coating, which is difficult for pesticides to penetrate. Research and grower experience has shown us that integrating a surfactant-like capsule for foliar sprays can be beneficial to help penetrate into this waxy membrane. This is potentially why we find growers having more positive results with using wet sprays as compared to using foggers. Here are several chemicals that have been considered as the go-to for mealybugs over the past few years. Similar to spider mites, however, growers are needing to rotate in different chemistries and oils to help manage this resilient pest. Oils are going to be the staple product for mealies, so if you're new to them, please reach out to GGS Pro for specific considerations when using them effectively and safely. In the previous slide, we saw how mealybugs stick around on the bottom or edges of containers. They also do this for flats, benches, and other structures within the greenhouse. This is partially how they stick around in an operation crop after crop. For growers who reuse their containers, flats, and carry trays, here are some cleaners and sanitizers with respective rates for either dunking or spraying these sort of items. Please note Green Shield is no longer on the market, which I know was a staple for some time. A proper and enhanced substitute for this product would be Clean Grow. Now, 2024 is not necessarily the year for new products or technology. 2025 should bring some new things that will aid the industry. However, a hot topic this year has been the considerable decrease in the use of neonics, and this has been a trend for the last several years. Your Safari, Marathon, Flagship, and TriStars of the world have and will continue to be taken out of our growers' chemical closets due to social, environmental, and legislative pressures. These products have been staples for many years because of their relative plant safety, price, and broad spectrum capabilities. The big question is now, what is the next neonic? Now, as it relates to neonics, which are chemicals designated as mode of action 4A, within that group there were several chemistry items that were used for broad spectrum control, specifically as an insecticidal drench. Now, when we look at all the other pesticides that we have available that can be used as insecticide drenches, there's really only a few. Let's talk about some of the two that we believe are going to replace the neonics here in the coming years. The first one is mainspring. Some of you may have already heard of this. It's been gaining popularity in the industry for several years now. This is mode of action 28. First thing I'm going to say about mainspring, and we learned this the hard way, is that it should be used as a protectant. It should not be used as a knockdown. We should be using this as a drench early on once that plant is clean, or starting out when that plant is completely clean. The general rate is about 8 ounces per 100 gallons. Some growers use less, from 6, and some growers use even higher at 12 ounces per 100 gallons. In general, the middle of the line area would be 8 ounces per 100 gallons, which is most commonly used. Now, the concentration mixed and the concentration applied are equally as important when it comes to this chemical, meaning that the amount of chemistry that I actually apply per pot and how I actually mix up that chemistry are very, very important to ensure this product works effectively. Reach out to GGS Pro. We have an entire bulletin, one-page bulletin that outlines the proper drench volume for using different insecticidal drenches such as mainspring. Another thing that's important about mainspring is that transplant or freshly transplanted plant needs about 3 to 4 weeks to have a good enough root system to take up the product. Ideally, most growers want to apply an insecticide right after transplant, but it's important that mainspring, if you're applying mainspring, that plant has a good enough root system to uptake that product. It's very, very important. Also, what's important to mainspring is that we do not want to be leaching this product for at least 5 days after it's treated, meaning that I do not want, if I'm going to irrigate, odds are I need to be, after I've applied mainspring, wait at least 5 days to be after that time to make sure that I'm not leaching out mainspring from the container. All of these considerations are important to maximize mainspring's efficacy and residual. When we talk about the two main advantages of mainspring is that its residual is about 6 to 8 weeks and it's very plant safe. As we said though, there are several considerations that are specific to utilizing mainspring. When we look at all the other insecticides that have a drench label, Contos is the other one that points out to us as being very broad spectrum and also a very long residual. Contos has a residual of about 5 to 7 weeks, and it's the only miticide that can be drenched. This is very important when we talk about broad mites and spider mites. Most of the chemistries that we use for miticides are very resistant at this point, and Contos is one of those chemicals that has been underutilized for this purpose, and thus it still has some efficacy. Now, when it comes to Contos, there are a few things that are specific to this chemical as well. The drench volume is equally as important as how we mix up that stock tank, just like mainspring. Now, Contos has a bit of a complex label, so we have derived an internal calculator that actually will calculate how to mix up your stock tank for Contos, depending on the number of containers that you're drenching, as well as their sizes. If you're new to Contos, please reach out to GGS Pro. We'd be happy to do these calculations for you. Now, something specific to Contos is that it takes a very long time to get up into the plant, anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. Now, during this time, a grower may need to spray something to provide a protectant or prevention for any type of issue while that Contos is being uptaken by the plant and control is being met. Also, something to note here is that Contos does have some phyto concerns that is listed on the label. The three major crops that typically growers run into are Dracaena, geraniums, and verbena, but there are several others and we recommend reading the label for further details. Once again, this is the only miticide that we're really seeing that has a lot of efficacy still in a wide range of crops. So we heavily consider looking into Contos, especially if you grow a wide range of crops that do not meet the phyto concerns that are susceptible to various different mites. We put this table in here because we know more and more growers are integrating potted herbs into their product offerings. Please reach out to GGS Pro for this herbs insecticide and fungicide guides that shows the various products listed for different herb species. The next pest we're going to talk about is probably the most common one we run into year after year. These are aphids. Aphids come in every shape, size, and color, and they also attack almost every sort of species we grow. As you can see here, aphids are considered communal, so you often see many of them together rather than them being solitary. They reproduce primarily asexually, meaning they can clone themselves at an incredibly fast rate. Although there are several pest species we run into that are not considered a major issue, These are one of them, and they will not go away on their own. This year in particular, we were plagued with late season aphid pressures on hanging baskets. Many growers grow their hanging baskets on the ground until they need to hang them for space. At that time, they drench them with a long residual insecticide such as mainspring. Once hung, however, they are very difficult to spray or scout for. After about 6 to 8 weeks, once that drench was made, there's still a few weeks before those baskets are sold. However, there's no more active ingredient in the plant to prevent aphids or other pests from attacking. In a few slides, we'll be talking about additional strategies for this sort of situation going forward. If for whatever reason you're not able to actually find the aphids, we can typically find their calling cards. Aphids leave a bright white cast skin when they molt, which is a dead giveaway aphids are present, as seen on the photo on the left. On the right, we can see signs of heavy aphid feeding by the development of something called sooty mold. This is sort of that black grayish sort of speckling on the foliage on the right. Basically, the honeydew or waste produced by aphids falls to lower foliage, providing a great food source for sooty mold to sporulate. Whiteflies are great at producing this secondary issue as well. This table shows some of the major aphid control products used by greenhouse producers. Our neonic, or mode of action 4A group, which we've talked about a little bit already, has been around for a long time, and although they still play a valuable role in crop protection strategies, we're seeing more and more cases of resistance or these products being removed from crop protection programs altogether. It's worth mentioning there's also other products within the mode of action 4 group, such as Expire and Altus, which are good knockdown products for aphids. We need to be careful not to rotate between two modes of action for chemicals, regardless if they're in different subgroups. Endeavor, Rycar, and Ventigra are all feeding blockers that stop the aphid's ability to actively cause damage quickly. Contos and Mainspring, which we've already discussed in decent detail, are both long residual drench products, whereas Protea and Aria are effective spray options. In the very last row, we have several biological-based insecticides that are making their way into more and more spray programs because of their novel modes of action, and thus lack of resistance issues. Going back to the hanging basket situation we saw on a slide a few moments ago, think about drenching Endeavor or Altus around 6 to 8 weeks after you've applied your original either Contos or Mainspring drench. These shorter residual chemicals will be able to help keep your baskets clean until they're sold. Next up, we have thrips. We can see in this photo that the thrips scrape away at the leaf surface, leaving behind groupings of leaf discoloration and black spots, which are actually waste products left behind by the thrips. These are the easiest ways to determine if thrips are present. We'll be talking primarily about the most up-to-date control strategies for western flower thrips. However, we are aware of a new invasive species of thrips called pepper thrips. We're all learning more and more about this new pest as information and experience becomes available, but please reach out to GGS Pro for our best spray program specific to this thrip species if you want to be prepared. Thrips attack newly developing and older growth. As we can see here, eating away at the meristematic areas or growing points of the plant can cause a great depreciation on product quality as the foliage expands. As the foliage expands, the thrip scarring does as well, causing a more malformed leaf or flower. Similarly, thrip scarring causes a weak point in the foliage tissue, which can actually tear open as they expand, causing a sort of spot that looks similar to caterpillar or slug damage. Sweet potato or Helianthus species commonly exhibit this issue as well. If you're either receiving young plant material with incoming thrips or an infestation pops up naturally, there are various foliar-applied knockdown products that have still been shown to be effective based on research data and grower feedback. Please keep in mind, some specific plant and bloom safety concerns have been exhibited for IGR, insect growth regulator, azadirachtin-based products, as well as Pylon and Hachi Hachi, which are still very useful thrip products. We still see growers using abamectin-based products such as Avid quite a bit for thrip control. However, we recommend integrating an IGR like azadirachtin, which could be Aztino, Azadirect, Azagard, or others, to aid in abamectin's efficacy. Even if starting clean, growers who know which crops they're growing that are going to attract thrips year after year may consider using a long residual preventative drench early on, such as Mainspring or Contos, as we talked about earlier. Please note that Contos provides an additional benefit of preventing spider mite and broad mites, however requires 2 to 3 weeks to be fully taken up into the plant. For something like thrips, You'll definitely need to be getting a spray on to provide some residual protection until this chemical is taken up. Both Contos and Mainspring will provide multiple weeks of residual control for thrips, but are most effective when used preventatively. They do not want to be used when heavy thrip damage is already present. We want to make sure that plant is clean before these are put on. These are great options for hanging baskets, where spraying can become even more labor intensive throughout the season. We also provided several organic and conventional spray options here on this slide for growers who grow vegetable transplants. Of the products listed totally on this slide, M52 is a blast from the past. You may remember a chemical called Met52. Well, it is back as now named M52 by Lallemand. We foresee this being a very valuable insecticide tool for ornamental and edible growers in the coming years. In terms of resistance management, we see growers rotating in more and more biological-based insecticides or insect growth regulators. Here are various options to consider which utilize fungal-based insecticides like Bavaria bassiana-based products coupled with an azadirachtin-based insect growth regulator. Here's a recommended program utilizing a microbial or biological-based product in conjunction with an azadirachtin. Adding an IGR prevents the insect pest from developing and shedding its ectoskeleton, which provides more time for the fungal spores from the biological or microbial insecticide applied on the insect to sporulate and penetrate the insect, ultimately killing it. Because many of these insects have quick life cycles, multiple frequent applications are needed to control the next generation of newly hatched pests. This is a photo provided to us by BASF, and it actually tells a great story of how microbial insecticides, especially fungal-based ones, can work. Velifer, which is a Bavaria bassiana product by BASF, was applied to this whitefly, and under the right environmental conditions, it sporulated into the insect, killing it. And actually what we're seeing here is the sporulation even outside of the insect, which we can visually see under this microscope. As said earlier, there's very few pieces of technology or chemistry out on the market in 2024. However, this is something worth noting. We're seeing more and more growers integrate something called yellow sticky tape. As you can see here, we're all familiar with yellow sticky cards, which are small cards used for attracting flying insects for scouting purposes. Now, this same sort of concept is used on a larger scale when we have this yellow sticky tape, which is wrapped around pylons or structures within the greenhouse around production areas. This is such a large surface area that it attracts flying insects such as fungus gnats, shoreflies, and thrips, and we have so much surface area that we're actually able to physically reduce the pest pressure from a cultural method. This is something produced by beneficial insectary. And I'm not kidding. Obviously, every square inch of this yellow sticky tape is going to be eventually covered with something flying. Most oftentimes, it's something that we don't want, such as fungus gnats, shoreflies, and thrips. As you can see here, we are culturally, physically reducing the inoculum or the amount of pest pressure present in the greenhouse space. On to mites. Between spider mites and broad mites are much smaller, and they continue to be a major issue for a select number of species that we grow. Unfortunately, they cannot be seen with the naked eye, so by the time we see the damage, we generally already have an infestation. They target the new growth, so a couple things you need to be thinking about as you look for it when you're scouting. As they feed on the foliage, they actually inject a toxin. This toxin produces the foliage to be malformed, hyperaccumulation of chlorophyll causing a more darker green leaf appearance. It also creates sort of a leathery texture, and the foliage itself, edges primarily, will either fold upwards or inwards. This actually produces a great area for the broad mites to actually hide from pesticides and natural predators. Now, when you look at the plant, something you want to look for is the old growth will typically be fine, and then as we move up the plant to more newer growth, the damage gets worse and worse and worse. That's because the population of broad mites are moving up into the newest foliage, and they're also increasing in their population. Photo on the right here is a clever little photo, but it shows actually broad mites latching onto a whitefly, and it shows just how good they are at hitchhiking. Hitchhiking either on employees, insects, or tools is the best way for broad mites to get around throughout a production space. Here we're showing two other examples of broad mite damage. On the left we have begonia. As you can see here really closely, you can see that actually the predation of the flower buds has caused this plant to not flower at all. And if you look even closer, you can try to start to see some of the leathery texture visually right underneath where those flower buds are. That's where the broad mites are feeding. On the right, we have Thunbergia. And as you can see here, once again, the lower foliage looks fine, but as we move up into that plant, we have more leaf curling, more leaf rolling, because that broad mite population is increasing in number. Products listed in this table, which are italicized, are what we call translaminar systemics, which means if they are sprayed on the top of the leaf or petal, they will be absorbed down into the underside of the tissue. As mentioned, broad mites are very good at hiding in distorted growing tips that they create, making miticides such as Acari, sand mite, and oils, which are all effective if direct contact is made, less able to control populations simply because of the broad mite's ability to hide. It is worth mentioning that we have been receiving reports of abamectin having some resistance issues against broad mites, which has been a staple go-to for broad mite control for many years. That means that Savat, sand mite, Acari, and Pylon will need to pick up the slack here as this issue continues to progress. And once again, Contos, which is listed here on this table, is one of the only products that can be applied as a drench for spider and broad mite control, providing a long residual if there are no potential phytotoxicity issues as mentioned previously regarding the crops are growing. When we talk about the coin for mites, one side is broad mites, meaning the other side is spider mites. And I'm sure if you're growing plants that do attract spider mites, you've definitely run into this issue before. Spider mites are small but can be seen with the naked eye. The problem with them is that they're incredibly resistant to most of our chemistry at this point. They reproduce very, very quickly, and they doesn't take a lot of them to create a lot of damage or noticeable damage such as we can see here. This would be considered an infestation, and this plant should be culled. In high population, spider mites will produce this sort of webbing around foliage and flowers, and at this point it is very difficult, if not near impossible, to control. Although there are various different miticides available in the market, the reality is that all of these chemistry has been used repeatedly in the southeastern states for year-round production on crops that are magnets for spider mites. Thus, we have considerable resistance issues for this pest across the country. One thing that is effective and growers are beginning to adopt more of due to cost and efficacy is predatory mites. Phytocilus persimilis in particular is slotting in here. In general, predatory mites are easy to see. Most of them are orange to red or amber in color and move relatively quickly. They feed on both adult and nymph spider mites, and for persimilis in particular, these are mites that are blind and find their prey through volatiles of damaged plant material and through touch. Thus, they are spider mite specialists. These do require high humidity and temps over 65 degrees. And overall, they can be inexpensive or perfect for hotspot areas where spider mite magnet crops occur, both on the ornamental and edible side of things. The use of BCAs or biological control agents has continued to gain momentum over the last several years due to resistance issues as well as environmental concerns. Ultimately, growers wanting to use less pesticides need to find other ways of managing pest issues. Thus, we are using fire to fight fire, in this case, predatory mites. Now, there is some innovative technology coming out that as it relates to applying predatory mites. BioBee, which is a BCA provider, actually recently created this applicator called Bug Flow. This is actually an attachment that can go to a Makita or other appropriate electrical leaf blowers to actually apply bulk mites in large quantities over a large area very, very quickly. You can actually follow this website here, which provides more information on the bug flow, how to use it, how to calibrate it correctly, as well as a helpful YouTube video. We've said it once already in this presentation, and that is starting clean is very important to staying clean. And part of that is when you're inspecting incoming material, you want to make sure that is incredibly clean, not bringing on any pests or introducing any pests to the growing environment. One of the cultural methods / chemical methods we're seeing growers adopt in respect to this is the use of cutting and plant dips. Now, unfortunately, there's not that many pesticides, both insecticides, miticides, and fungicides, that are appropriately labeled for plant dips. However, we put together a list of these products into a 2-page bulletin that we'd be happy to send you. This provides the recommended rates as well as specific comments or instructions outlined in each of these products' labels. We'll be rounding off this presentation by talking about plant growth regulators and some of the common strategies and considerations when integrating them. PGRs are incredibly powerful tools, and we can use them in a variety of different ways. I put these two photos here to caution you though, however. These are incredibly powerful tools, and we need to be using them effectively and appropriately. I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm sure if someone is new who is listening to this and is new to PGRs, may have burnt themselves in the past when it comes to using them either in the inappropriate way or using them too strongly. On the left, we can actually see in patients that were applied too much of a plant growth regulator, and these plants may never grow again. And on the right, we actually have uniconazole, which is Sumagic, applied to tomato transplants. Now, what's interesting here, though, is what I want to show you is that when we are looking at issues, we want to look at the uniformity of that issue. If something is incredibly uniform, meaning it is affecting every single plant, which you can see here on the photo on the right is exactly what's happening, it's an indication to us that it's probably an abiotic issue, meaning that it's an input that each of the plants did receive equally. That could be a spray, like phytotoxicity, over amounts of fertilizer, nutritional issue, whatever it may be. But if it's related to an input or an abiotic issue, then odds are the symptom is very uniform across the entire crop. Now, there are many different resources out there that are very valuable for plant growth regulators. Applying PGRs is as much as an art as it is a science. So it's important to gather your resources together whenever you are utilizing PGRs to determine the right rates are being applied to the right crop. I wanted to put these two resources out here, which are publicly available, free online. They're Fine Americas and Grower Talks have put together basically almost an annually updated magazine or guide for annuals and perennials. We want to give a big thanks to Brian Whipker and Garrett Owen for putting these together. These are incredibly valuable. US Pro has also produced a helpful PGR tool that outlines how to mix up bonsai or paclobutrazol-based products. Most paclobutrazol-based products are 0.4% based paclobutrazol, with a few exceptions. That being said, if you're using a 0.4% paclobutrazol containing product, this is a great bulletin. It basically describes how to mix up different parts per million depending on the desired concentration, as well as it tells you how to apply using various different technologies, either through an injector or hand dipping. At this point, growers have a relatively large toolkit of PGRs to choose from, which can be a little bit overwhelming. We've included this table that lists both the brand chemical name and their associated generic option. For the sake of simplicity, we will be utilizing brand names for the majority of this presentation. However, as you can see, products can vary in their labeling. We can see that Dazide has a 12-hour REI compared to B9's REI of 24 hours. Cytoflora and Fresco are both approved for substrate drenches, whereas Configure and Fascination do not, respectively. Products can also vary in percent active ingredient, as with cholates being much more concentrated than Fluorel. And finally, Sumagic is labeled for some species of fruiting vegetable transplants, where its counterpart, Concise, is only labeled for ornamentals. It's worth noting that Sumagic is the only PGR that we're aware of that's labeled for various different fruiting vegetable transplants. This chart provides a lot of useful information. The major takeaways here are that PGRs can vary in where they are absorbed, how effective they are in slowing down growth, and the residual, how they can be applied, and the restricted entry interval or REI. Bonsai, which is paclobutrazol, Sumagic, which is uniconazole, and Top Floor, which is fluoropyrimidol, are all absorbed through the stems and roots, but not the foliage. This is important when you consider when to apply them during the plant's development and your production schedule. For example, applying bonsai as a spray to plants with dense canopies or little space between them can make foliar sprays less efficient than a substrate drench. Quickly, we just wanted to show these slides, which are quick references for small dose rate calculations. Oftentimes, growers are not mixing up an entire 100-gallon batch for foliar spray, so it's important to know how to mix up some of these PGRs and their relative concentrations when we're using small volumes. Let's take a deeper look into how the environment at the time of application influences PGR activity. These relationships outlined below come from research conducted by Dr. Eric Runkle at Michigan State University. When making foliar applications in a high relative humidity environment, this prolongs drying time, allowing for greater absorption into the plant tissue. On the contrary, let's think about what induces quick drying on a foliar applied pesticide. High air movement, high temperature, and high light levels. Thus, we would recommend making foliar applications in the morning or evening hours when conditions are more conducive to slower drying. Let's take a moment to highlight a very important PGR that we believe is still underutilized in the industry, which is fluorel. Fluorel is a very useful but finicky PGR when it comes to optimizing its efficacy. Growers routinely note a lack of consistency in the results of using fluorel. However, most oftentimes an important factor was overlooked. Fluorel does not translocate well within the plant, so thorough coverage over the entire plant is needed. It is important to remember fluorel contains ethophan, which when absorbed by the plant turns into ethylene. This is a naturally occurring plant hormone typically associated with plant stress. Applying fluorel to plants under any type of stress, such as something caused by drought, shipping, or transplant stress, can lead to a greater expression of this stress and potentially plant damage. Fluorel is a very acidic product, and it requires it to be kept at an acidic pH of 5.0 or below when being applied or mixed up. When mixing fluorel with high alkaline water sources, which is very common in the Northeast, it may be difficult to keep the solution pH below this target threshold. It may require something like sulfuric acid or using a product called Indicate 5 to lower the pH to the needed requirement. Indicate 5 contains an acid as well as a colorimetric reagent that changes color as the solution pH becomes lower. This is a helpful visual aid for making sure you have lowered your spray solution pH if the pH meter that you have on site is not working or it's not readily available. And finally, as things were not already complicated enough when it comes to fluorel, we also need to be applying this chemical at a precise temperature range of about 55 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Fluorel is commonly used for its ability to delay flower, allowing for more vegetative growth and the growth schedule of the crop to meet their potential window of sale. Dr. Roberto Lopez at Michigan State University shows here on two common plant species that when we go above 73 degrees Fahrenheit, the number of days to flower drastically decreases. Depending on the time of the year, applying in the morning or evening hours may be the only possible time when temperatures are low enough to not render the fluorel ineffective. As stated earlier, it's important to trial PGRs before diving headfirst. We work with various different growers who conduct in-house trials almost on a yearly basis. This is actually a photo from a grower who integrated fluorel for the first time this past year. Very good grower, however, they had never been really open to using fluorel up until now. So what did they do? They applied fluorel to half of their Calibraco and Petunia baskets and didn't apply fluorel to the others to see how they turned out. As we can see here, the ones on the right did flower sooner because they weren't delayed by the fluorel, but we can also see on the left that the plant, once it is ready to flower, which will probably be ready in a few days of decent weather, there's going to be a considerable number of more blooms compared to the one that was not treated with fluorel. As we can see here, fluorel has a variety of benefits, such as increasing flower count as well as free branching within the plant. If you're a mum grower, I guarantee you've ran into this situation at some point. These is crown buds or pre-budding on mums. These are brought on particularly for mums either in low feed situations or we're running into low night temperatures, which can cause this sort of premature budding on mums. Fluorel can be very effective at preventing crown buds, especially on susceptible genetics of mums. Please reach out to GGS Pro if this is something you run into on a yearly basis. We have a dedicated bulletin specifically to using fluorel preventing crown buds on mums. Here's an example of propagation where we're using a tank mix of B9 and fluorel. This is leading to smaller internodes, greater branching, and preventing unwanted flowers at this growth stage. Fluorel is unique in that it often is considered a chemical pinch product. In reality, it releases the apical dominance in the plant, promoting lower axillary nodes to begin growing. Well, we're showing this here, and thank you, Dr. Roel Hines, for providing this case study and photo. But we're showing this to show you that growers are integrating tank mixes of various different PGRs. There's quite a bit of research coming out of Fine Americas, as well as some of our PGR chemical producers, as well as academics as to what some of these more synergistic or more valuable tank mixes can lead to on specific crop species. If you recall, way earlier in the presentation, we were talking about mainspring and contos. We talked about how mixing up that chemical and the amount we actually apply per plant is equally important. The same thing can apply for PGRs. If you remember the first slide of this, when we began the PGR section, we showed you two photos of crops that received too much PGR and it had a negative effect or a phytotoxicity effect on that crop. This is an example here of when Cycocel, now known as Ultracell, is applied in too heavy of volumes. For most PGRs, we're spraying to a drip, but Cycocel/Ultracell is an exception to the rule. It's important that we only apply this product to a glycine. Over applying it can cause pulling on the edges of foliage or in certain plant species that have architecture that can easily trap chemical or solution. And what this leads to is a phyto damage or the bleaching effect of this foliage that you can see here on this geranium. Pivoting away from PGRs for a brief moment, let's talk about a cultural change that can easily have a positive impact on your overall production and use on PGRs. This table gives us an idea of how much phosphorus we're supplying our plants. At 200 parts per million, we can see the equivalent amount of phosphorus in some common fertilizers that are generally used for plant production. As we can see, we are most oftentimes applying far beyond what majority of our crops require. You may consider switching to a lower phosphorus containing fertilizer, such as 21-5-20, 17-4-17, or something in that regard. If you're seeing a noticeable amount of stretch in your crop, try to look at what fertilizer you're using. Excessive amounts of phosphorus can lead to plant stretch and thus over amounts of PGR reliance. We're going to finish this presentation off by talking about a few common PGR strategies for some staple crops that many of us grow in the spring season. If you're new to PGRs and are looking to integrate them, here are some reliable strategies that have been proven through grower experience as well as academic research. As we mentioned earlier, Sumagic, which contains uniconazole, is the only growth retardant available that is labeled for some fruiting vegetable crops. On the label, we'll provide specific instructions on the recommended concentrations, as well as how to apply them depending on the crop species. The major vegetable crops that will be labeled are tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. The rates can range from anywhere from 2 to 10 parts per million, but we do suggest growers err on the side of caution, using the smaller rates first before trialing higher rates, especially for tomatoes. There is also going to be instructions as far as how can it be applied, meaning generally that it needs to be applied at the 2 to 4 leaf stage, and then a second application can be made anywhere from 7 to 14 days after the first application. This ensures that there's no residual that can impact the consumer. Fruiting vegetable transplant production is becoming more and more common, and we're getting flooded with questions as far as how to use Sumagic appropriately for something like tomato production or tomato transplant production. As I've said earlier, GGS Pro does write a lot and we do speak a lot, so we take your comments and input and questions and try to formulate resources that can help you rather than having to have a 30-minute conversation. This is an example of one. Please reach out to GGS Pro if you are a tomato transplant producer or you believe you're producing vegetable transplants that fit under the Sumagic label. This will outline specifically recommendations for using this PGR and other cultural considerations when producing this crop. The first ornamental crop we're going to be talking about is fuchsia. Fuchsia is also gaining quite a bit of popularity as a spring annual basket. It generally is grown in a few different size containers. In order to produce a well-branched, full basket containing fuchsia, we use a combination of fluorel and pinching. Generally, the pinching or fluorel treatment is the number of fluorel treatments or pinching is based on the container size and the production schedule. Generally, we want to make the last fluorel application prior to February 25th. This prevents us from delaying flower into the general selling time window for spring. We will use a general rate of 500 parts per million fluorel, which is very common for most crops. What's interesting about fuchsia is that we can drench them at 1 part per million about 2 to 4 weeks after our last pinch or fluorel application, right before bud set. And what this does is actually produces a considerable increase in the number of bud set or flowers that end up having on the plant. We've learned this through grower experience. In various vigorous varieties, we may have to go up to 2 parts per million, but generally 1 part per million as a drench is all we need for most genetics. Calliope geraniums have been a staple in most growers' portfolios for many years, and the reason why is because they're so easy to grow and they're very reliable. Other than maintaining a high pH, Calliope geraniums are fairly problem-proof. We will be using fluorel at a much lower rate. Geraniums in general are sensitive to fluorel. As you probably know, they don't hold up too well in shipping stresses, and so we don't want to over apply this stress-inducing plant growth regulator. Generally, we'll get away with 350 parts per million as soon as they are established after transplant, followed by about 1,000 part per million, somewhere around 1,000 part per million foliar spray of Cycocel/Ultracell as needed. We will want to prevent doing Cycocel applications as they start producing flowers, as that can damage flowers fairly easily. Also, once they're getting ready to flower, we want to try to stop them using a higher, much stronger PGR, generally bonsai. We'll go with either 2.5 part per million foliar spray when we're about 75% to finish size, or that would correspond to about a quarter of a part per million as a drench when they're nearly finished. As you notice, both the foliar spray and the drench rate for calliope geraniums are very low. Generally, they don't need a lot of PGR in general, and they're very sensitive to paclobutrazol specifically. Going from a high pH loving crop to now some low pH loving crops, let's start with verbena. So verbena obviously is a great partner with something like calibrachoa or petunia, very vigorous, requires similar nutritional needs, and we can treat them very similarly from a PGR standpoint. Fluorel, 500 parts per million, very common. As soon as established, this is going to help get some free branching and get some bulking on that plant. B9 applications, 5,000 parts per million, no problem. Bonsai will take quite a bit of bonsai as a foliar spray as well, 30 parts per million. This would equate to, if you're using Sumagic and trying to integrate it into your crop production, that would equate to about 10 to 20 parts per million as a foliar spray. As we get kind of closer, as spring starts to heat up and our B9 applications really don't do as much, we're going to need to go to bonsai drenches. Anywhere from 1 to 2 parts per million is enough to keep most verbena in check. Obviously, it's important that we try to prevent trimming back our plants as much as possible. So getting on early bonsai drenches is probably fairly important. Definitely as we start reaching the outer edges of the pot, bonsai drenches are going to be the only thing that really slow down this crop, especially if the temperature is hot and the light levels are high. As I just said, verbena and calibrachoa and petunia all go hand in hand, or in a lot of mixed planters nowadays. And as you're going to see, we're going to have very similar PGR requirements. 500 parts per million as soon as established. Bonsai Sumagic drenches, they're going to be the very kind of go-to hitters once we've got a decent root system and some biomass behind us. It's very difficult to slow down petunias and calibrachoa, as well as verbena, if we're feeding them correctly and the weather is on our side. We can generally get away with 1 to 2 parts per million as a bonsai drench. For most of our lower vigor petunia and calibrachoas, some of your wave petunia or vegetative petunia genetics are going to be much more vigorous, and we've seen growers go all the way up to 5 parts per million. So just be aware, if you're trying to prevent shearing back plants as much as you can, don't be afraid to be aggressive with PGR, specifically bonsai, when it comes to some of these vigorous varieties. So let's pivot a moment and think about flat production. When we're talking about producing vigorous plants in small containers, there's a lot of challenges that can be ahead of us. Um, Once again, don't be afraid to be aggressive when it comes to when growing petunias, especially in small containers or flats. A lot of growers do like to use B9 when the plants are about 1.5 inch in diameter, meaning we're just getting established shortly after transplant. 5,000 parts per million B9 helps. Just tone them just a little bit. We're going to want to do repeat applications, but be careful because too many, typically at once we reach kind of the 2 to 3 application interval of B9, it can delay flower. And that's a general rule of thumb for B9. So generally we want to hold on, we want to prevent applying B9 more than twice for a single crop, as that can have some delay in blooms. Bonsai foliar sprays, 30 to 45 parts per million is kind of the standard. That would equate to 30 parts per million for Sumagic as a foliar spray. Now, what I want to say here is bonsai, it needs to be taken up through the roots or through the stems. If you have a very thick planting or just even just a general flat, once it's rooted out, once that foliage really starts to overlap with each other and it becomes dense, it can be really difficult to get a foliar spray down into the stems where that bonsai is actually going to be taken up. So that's why drenches actually become very important. And also, that's even challenging in itself as well. When a tray is just too condensed, and has too much foliage, it can be difficult to actually water bonsai uniformly into the tray. The general rates we will want to use are 2 to 3 parts per million. We're going to use something slight when we're talking about petunias in this sort of situation. We use something a little bit heavier than 1 to 2 parts per million. We're generally around that 2 to 3 parts per million range, just because we really they're so much leaves are overlapping. They really want to stretch on you. They really want to grow. So we have to boost that bonsai rate up just a little bit to hold them. It can be challenging growing plants in such a small area and such a small pot. It becomes even much more of a challenge, especially when that species is incredibly vigorous, such as a petunia. We thank Joe Moore at Lucas Greenhouse for providing this trial data as well as this photo, telling us a good story. They actually provided a 3 part per million drench to this flat 14 days after transplant, and this was able to hold all of these plants very tightly, and not enough PGR effect though from when these are transplanted that they won't be stunted. They will be able to grow out once they're in fresh soil, either in the landscape, in a container, whatever it may be, and provide a good quality product for the consumer. We're rounding out this PGR section by talking about pansies. Now, spring and fall pansy production remains to still be a very common staple in most people's production line. Now, pansies historically have been utilizing bonsai as well as B9 as their major PGR options. However, with research from both academics as well as our PGR vendors, we now know that pansies can be controlled using various different PGRs, including A-Rest, a combination of A-Rest and B9, as well as use of Fluorel. All of these can be used in specific situations at different stages of the crop, both in spring and fall production. Please feel free to reach out to GGS Pro if you have specific questions in integrating new PGR options for your pansy crop this coming year. Finally, we put this photo in here as it relates to fall and spring pansy production, is that when we're applying a foliar spray of paclobutrazol or another PGR, we try to minimize the amount of solution that's actually getting into bare soil. We're probably aware that the concentrations we use for a foliar spray can easily be a magnitude or more compared to what we use concentration-wise for a substrate drench. So we want to minimize this high amount of PGR actually going into the soil. So it's important when you are applying a PGR to freshly transplanted material when there is a lot of open soil and not a lot of foliar cover. It is important that we do spray to a glisten and we try to minimize the amount of actual PGR that's dripping into the soil, thus potentially causing more of a PGR effect than what's intended. Once again, thank you for joining us for the 2024 Virtual Expo with Griffin Greenhouse Supplies. If you should have any questions regarding the material that was discussed in this presentation, or if anything comes up in the near future, please don't hesitate to reach out to GGS Pro using the contact information listed on this slide. Thank you.